So good late afternoon to everyone and welcome. Welcome to our ORMA question and answer with Quentin Palfrey, candidate for Attorney General. We will have separate sessions with Andrea Campbell and Sharon Liss Riordan on Saturday, the 21st. We'll be letting people in to the Zoom room as we try to get to know each other a little bit right before we start the show. My name, again, is Martha Karcher. I am a member of the Jamaica Plain Progressives and a co-chair with Henry Wardis of Our Revolution, Massachusetts. So as people come in, please introduce yourselves in the chat, say where you're from, and feel free to put questions that you want to pose to our candidate for Attorney General, Quentin Palfrey, who's here with us tonight. We'd love to know a little bit about what matters to you. Please share that in the chat. Feel free to use the chat to greet other participants who are here. And again, welcome. We appreciate everyone's interest in the position of Attorney General, obviously a critical statewide elected office. So again, my name is Martha Karcher. I am with the Jamaica Plain Progressives, and I'm currently serving as co-chair of Our Revolution, Massachusetts. It's now 5 o'clock. We're getting close. We should get started in the next 2 or 3 minutes. We have a lot of questions tonight, but we also would love to hear other people's concerns and questions, so feel free to write them in the chat. Welcome, Samuel Pierce. It's good to have you here. My name is Martha Karcher. I'm with Jamaica Plain Progressives and currently serving as co-chair of Our Revolution, Massachusetts. Please feel free to add questions in the chat, introduce yourself, say where you're from. You can also mention some of the issues that are important to you as we go into this forum. Question and answer with Quentin Palfrey, candidate for Attorney General. We will have separate sessions with Andrea Campbell and Sharon Liss Riordan on Saturday, the 21st. So it's a beautiful afternoon, and I must say I'm grateful both to our candidate, Quentin Palfrey, for being here and being willing to share this Zoom room space with us as he answers our questions. And welcome to everybody else who joins us. As we've tried to make sure everyone is aware, we are streaming this on Facebook, this forum, and it will also be on Facebook. So I think we're getting close. Why don't, unless someone would like to, from behind the scenes, slow us down, I think I'm going to go ahead and officially open our forum. So welcome everyone to our Q&A with candidate for Attorney General Quentin Palfrey, who is seeking endorsement by Our Revolution. Tonight's forum will be recorded and available on Our Revolution Massachusetts Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. Welcome, Chris Spears from OR Blue Hills, and thank you for being willing to give our invocation this afternoon.
Thank you, Martha. We recognize that we meet this evening on lands taken from Indigenous people. We affirm our solidarity with Indigenous people, such as the Anishinaabe collection of North American tribes, as well as our more local brothers and sisters, tribes such as the Massachusetts, Mashpee, Pecumtuck, Wampanoag, and Narragansett peoples. We recognize that we live within the American capitalist system founded on slavery, a system that established a legacy of violence and selfish acquisition that includes mass shootings, racism, sexism, homophobia, support of oppressive foreign governments, and economic inequality. We stand with the working class in their rights to dignity, a living wage, and competitive benefits. Through forums like this one, we endeavor to educate the public on these complex issues by finding constructive solutions regarding a new way forward.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our Revolution Massachusetts is organizing a grassroots political revolution to challenge power and to prioritize the needs of all people and our planet. We are building a statewide movement by fighting for economic, racial, social, sexual, gender, and environmental justice for all. ORMA can't educate people about our endorsed candidate or advocate on issues without your participation. We run on the efforts of volunteers and the contribution of donors. Take a moment to volunteer or make a donation. Check the links in the chat. Helping us with getting questions from OR members are Robin Bergman of OR Arlington and Henry Wordis of OR Cambridge. They will take turns presenting the questions. I'm going to give a very brief biography before we turn to the question and answer phase. Quentin Palfrey grew up in Southborough before moving on to Harvard and Harvard Law School. In Massachusetts, he has served as an assistant attorney general and later as the first chief of the healthcare division in the office of the Massachusetts Attorney General. In the latter position, he oversaw consumer protection litigation and investigations relating to health insurance, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, healthcare providers, and nursing homes. He served in President Obama's White House Office of the Science and Technology Policy. In 2021, he joined the Biden administration as Deputy General Counsel at the United States Department of Commerce. He currently lives in Weston with his wife, Anna, and their 3 children. Quentin, to allow us to pose as many questions as possible, we ask that you limit your answers to 2 minutes. Some questions were admitted in advance. We are choosing questions so that we may cover as many topics as possible. Apologies if we do not get to your question. So are we going to give Quentin a 2-minute
Yes.
opportunity to introduce himself? So Quentin, you have 2 minutes to tell us who you are and a little bit about your experiences.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with our revolution. I'm Quentin Palfrey. I'm a proud progressive Democrat running for Attorney General. I was moved by the invocation today, in particular because there was motion forward in terms of trying to get rid of our racist flag and seal. I think that we need to make sure that we're moving urgently to dismantle structural racism in all its forms. So as a former assistant attorney general, I've seen firsthand how much impact the AG can have on communities all across Massachusetts. When Trump was in office, it was inspiring to see the AG fight back again and again against a corrupt and immoral administration. But now more than ever, with our fundamental rights under attack, with our democracy literally under attack, we need the AG to stand up for a bold progressive vision and to take on the really big challenges that we face, some of the same challenges that are at the heart of our revolution. So that's structural racism, that's the climate crisis, that's attacks on our democracy, attacks on workers' rights. That's reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, fighting gun violence, fighting against rising housing costs and structural inequality in our economy. We have a lot of work to do. And what I encourage you to do as we talk through these issues is compare my vision and my experience, and in particular, my progressive values with the other candidates in this race. I believe that we need an AG who will fight for single payer, who will fight for safe injection sites, who will fight for our public schools and not for expanding charter schools, who really believes in fair, free transit and police accountability, criminal justice reform, who believes in the fundamental values of our revolution. So I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think we're at a critical moment where most of the most important things that we can do are going to start right here at the grassroots and with state leadership. We're not going to have that kind of leadership from the Supreme Court or from Congress, and we need it to begin right here at the grassroots and with state leadership.
Thank you, Quentin. So Robin Bergman will ask our first question from our OR members.
Hi, sorry, my sound went out for a second. Did you just introduce me?
Hi, Robin. Hear you fine.
Oh, hi. Okay, great. So thank you so much for being here tonight, Quentin. Here's your first question. What are the main changes you would make from your predecessor to the Attorney General's roles and priorities?
So I think that there are a number of ways in which the Attorney General's office has been very successful, particularly in fighting against the Trump administration, taking on ExxonMobil, those sorts of things. I personally believe that we can do more on a few areas. One is with respect to civil liberties and police accountability. I do disagree with the current Attorney General's approach on no-knock warrants, on facial recognition. I differ on some of the plans that were put in place to deal with the mass incarceration situation. I don't think we're going to arrest and incarcerate our way out of challenges that are primarily about substance use disorder, mental health challenges, housing instability. I think we really need to invest in prevention. I'm a big fan of single payer and would like to see Massachusetts move towards Medicare for all. I would like to see more accountability around the state police in particular and police in general. So I do think that there are some differences on civil liberties and police reform issues. But I do think that we also have a very successful platform to build from, and the professionalism of the office has a very high level to build on.
Thank you, Quentin. Our next question comes from Henry Wurtis.
Right. So following up with respect to police departments, you know, we've got hundreds, maybe thousands, I don't know, of different police departments all across the state. What is the role of the Attorney General's office in dealing with each of those distinct local municipal police departments? And how do you see carrying out that role under your tenure?
Sure. Well, let me talk about the big problem, and then I'll talk about the role of the AG, I think, in trying to deal with that. I think we imprison too many people for too long for doing too little. Race has too much to do with who ends up in the criminal justice system. The war on drugs has been a horrific failure that has led to over-incarceration, has led to extraordinary racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And so I think the AG needs to be a leader in pushing for bold criminal justice reform, police accountability, corrections oversight, and that needs to be a big part of the mandate of the office. Some of that is being a thought leader, and some of that is in what we do within our own responsibilities. I've been very inspired by Rachel Rollins in particular in using prosecutorial discretion, innovating to try to use non-prosecution as a way of dealing with structural racism in our criminal legal system. So I think there's a lot more that we can do there. On police accountability, I am a big fan of eliminating qualified immunity. There are some differences on that issue in this race, but I think in the wake of the George Floyd murder and Breonna Taylor and a lot of other things that we've seen, there should not be a special defense for police officers who are involved in a violent altercation with a civilian. I would also like to see a statewide database that is organized by the Attorney General that has information about dishonesty and fabrication of evidence by local law enforcement, so that we can give it as exculpatory evidence in prosecutions, and also so that the public has access to that information. To your particular question, Henry, I think that the AG can do a lot more to oversee both state police misconduct and local malfeasance. I think that if the AG doesn't do it, very often it doesn't get done. We have a duty to make sure that the people who are in public trust are actually acting in the public's best interest, and that we stand up against structural racism wherever we find it, particularly in law enforcement. So I'd like to see the AG office be much more aggressive on police accountability.
Thank you, Quentin. Robin?
So sticking with the police issue, what's your position on civil asset forfeiture, and what do you think you can do as Attorney General to either abolish it or reform it?
Yeah, well, I have real concerns about it, and I think that it is something that has led to significant injustice. On the question of what we can do to reform that, I think that primarily that is working with the legislature and raising the issue on the bully pulpit. I can review our own activities within the Attorney General's office to see whether that is a tool that has been used in the fairly limited criminal prosecutions that the AG would be engaged in that would touch on that issue. My understanding is that the majority of the times that would be employed, it would be employed by district attorneys. And so it would be more an opportunity for us to be thought leaders and to push for reforms at the statewide level and with the district attorneys. That said, I think that we should be very bold in using the platform of the Attorney General's office to push for significant reforms to our criminal legal system, including abusive civil asset forfeiture, because I think it is something that has caused significant injustice.
Thank you, Quentin. Henry?
So returning more specifically to local police departments, a number of cities across the state and indeed across the country have taken initiatives to move emergency responses to certain types of situations out of police department jurisdiction, and have had, we don't know yet about Massachusetts, but elsewhere, great success. My question to you is, given that there is a state bill that would provide state funding to support these efforts, do you support that? And do you think it's an important step to be taken by towns and cities across the state? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I do agree that that's a very smart approach. I think we want to match the skills and mandate and backgrounds and resources of the people responding to emergency situations with what is most appropriate for that situation. And so when you're talking about a situation that primarily relates to substance use disorder or mental health or unstable housing or other kinds of social services challenges, the person responding to that concern in the first instance shouldn't be somebody who's primarily trained in law enforcement, who's carrying a gun, whose way of engaging with situations tends to be focused on things other than mental health or substance use disorder or social services. And so I think that we need to realign our our resources and invest in making sure that we're actually handling the challenges that present themselves in communities. And in general, I mean, I think we need a mindset shift. We, the war on drugs has been an utter failure, and we've thought about dealing with problems by arresting and incarcerating, by sort of dealing with it as law enforcement problems. That has not worked. And we need to shift both our approach and the resources to match a more prevention-oriented approach. The other thing I will say is that mirrors something that we need to do in the healthcare system. So in the law enforcement system, we tend too much to incarcerate and deal with problems after they're a problem, as opposed to trying to deal with the underlying challenges that lead to that. We do the same thing in the healthcare system. We tend to underinvest in prevention, in chronic disease management, in mental health services, substance use services, and then we end up dealing with things in an inpatient kind of a context that we really should have invested in. That's one of the reasons why single payer is so important, and why our system is so misaligned by underinvesting in prevention. In general, I think we ought to be shifting our resources to trying to deal with the underlying societal challenges, the structural racism, the wealth and economic inequality that we see, and try to really take on the underlying challenges, as opposed to using quick fixes, band-aids, but also things that we've seen not work and lead to racist outcomes.
Thank you, Quentin. Robin.
So following on your views about law enforcement and alternative methods and et cetera, do you support the moratorium on the construction of new prisons? There's a proposal right now to build a new $52 million women's prison. Do you think it should be built?
I do not think it should be built. I do support the moratorium. I think in general, we've created this carceral system that has, that is imprisoning higher and higher percentages of our population. If you look at our rates of incarceration relative to other countries, it's staggeringly out of proportion. There's huge racial disparities in terms of who ends up incarcerated. And I don't think the solution is to arrest more people, build more prisons, and throw more people in jail. The solution is to really shift our mindset to trying to disrupt the cradle to prison pipeline, invest in preventative measures like substance use disorder treatment, mental health services, fixing our public schools, fixing some of the inequities in our economy, and taking on the really hard work of making a more just society.
Thank you, Quentin. Henry.
Okay, so regulatory processes shape how much information the public receives about the conditions faced by incarcerated people. How can you use existing policies to bring more transparency to our prisons and jails? And what further transparency rules would you advocate for?
So thanks so much for that question. I put out a proposal on some of the corrections oversight measures that I would like to undertake urgently when we take on the Attorney General's office. And the first one relates to the horrific conditions in Department of Corrections facilities. We've seen when state senators like Jamie Eldridge and others visit these facilities, the mistreatment that we learn about, and the very poor conditions that incarcerated people face are really very troubling. And one of the things that I've called for is the creation of a dedicated unit within the Attorney General's office that can do investigations and oversight of those conditions and be able to really respond urgently to those challenges. There are a number of other things I would like to take on. One of them is to make sure that a formerly incarcerated person is part of our senior leadership team or our advisory structure, so that we're hearing directly from people. I know that this is not my own personal life experience, and I want to make sure that I am hearing directly in our advisory process from formerly incarcerated people. I want to make sure that there is greater attention to services within houses of correction, so that we're really focusing on giving services, mental health services, substance use services, but also education and sort of reentry kinds of services there. We need to do a better job of making sure that incarcerated people can vote. We need to do a better job of making it possible for them to make phone calls. I don't know whether you followed this issue, but this issue of the very extravagant charges that incarcerated people have to pay even to make phone calls is really outrageous. We need to fix that.
Thank you, Quentin. Robin.
Will you investigate and prosecute crimes committed in connection with illegal foreclosures? These seem to be epidemic lately. The current AG has rejected criminal referrals in about 4 dozen such cases and has never prosecuted a single one.
Yeah, the answer is yes, and I've heard directly, and it may be an OR member, it may just be another concerned person who has been bringing this matter to my attention. It's very troubling. I think that the AG is particularly well suited to take on challenges within the mortgage foreclosure and rental and lending services. We have that is a very big part of the Attorney General's mandate, and there may be some times where it's appropriate to use criminal powers as well. There obviously are different standards and often different teams that need to be devoted to challenges that need to be in a criminal standard versus a civil standard. But we certainly need to have that be in our set of tools that are available. And I've been hearing some of the specifics and some of the concerns about the approach that the office has taken recently, and would love to look into that, because I think both criminal and civil tools should be available for those kinds of issues.
Thank you, Quentin. Henry.
Right. So do you think it's time and appropriate for housing to be considered as a human right, much the way we consider early education to be a right? I wish that it was true for medical care as well. But what about housing? Is that a step that we could take, and do you see a path to achieving that?
So it's a wonderful question. It's hard to think of anything more important for the government to do than to guarantee access to our most basic needs, to housing, to food, to healthcare. So yes, I would love to see it move in that direction. I certainly think that healthcare and food are also human rights. And this may be beyond the way that an AG can address it. But let me mention that I've always thought that when the governor is creating a budget, the first thing in the budget should be making sure that there are no waiting lists for shelter, that there is a housing for everyone, that there is food for everyone, and that we build up from our basic needs. And it is always shameful when you see how few services we provide. So yes, I think that it's absolutely necessary, and I think the AG has a major role to play in housing and in addressing housing security issues. So that some of that is with respect to banks and lending and mortgage foreclosures that we're just talking about. Some of that is about rentals. One issue in this race that I will point out is that I do believe that rent control should be one of the tools that is available to address really out of control housing costs. One of my opponents in a previous race filled out a questionnaire saying that she did not believe that rent control should be available as a tool. And so that is another difference in this race.
Thank you, Quentin. Robin.
So extending the idea of what our rights are, should city and state law enforcement agencies cooperate with ICE in arresting and holding refugees seeking asylum, or should we be protecting them better?
The answer is absolutely not. Under no circumstances should there be cooperation between state and local law enforcement or other government officials and ICE or CBT or other immigration officials. I'm a proud alum of both the Obama and the Biden administration, but I will tell you that cruel treatment of immigrants has been unfortunately endemic in both Democratic and Republican administrations over the last few decades. It is just shameful. for us to treat folks from other countries the way that we do. It broke my heart to see children in cages, to see the way that the last administration treated this question of immigration, including, by the way, some mayors and other local officials here in Massachusetts. You saw the mayor of Springfield, for example, participate in trying to raid a church that was holding sanctuary for a family that federal immigration officials wanted to deport. That's just shameful. That shouldn't happen in Massachusetts. We had a sheriff who wanted to send incarcerated people to the border to help build the wall. So we've really lost our way here, and Massachusetts needs to be a moral leader on this issue. There's also a practical aspect to this that can be integrated into the rationale. I think this is a moral issue, but as a practical matter, it is really harmful to public safety if folks who are undocumented fear for their loved ones or for their own safety if they cooperate with law enforcement, because in the times when you need to work with fire or police, and if you're fearful to come forward, tragic consequences can ensue. So even from the very, very narrow tactical point of view, it's a very bad idea, but it's also just deeply immoral.
Thank you, Quentin. Henry.
Right. So I have one more housing related question, but it's a broader question as well. So there's a striking difference in the amount of wealth equity held by white people in this state and Black people. The figure that's been quoted for a number of years is $250,000 for whites and $8 for Black people. For most people, their wealth equity is in the home that they own, right? So you see a path to addressing that in some conceivable way? And does the notion of restitution play a role in your thinking about that question? That's a double question, but I'm sure you can handle it.
So it is staggeringly undemocratic and immoral for us to have the disparity of wealth that we've seen. And unfortunately, it is accelerating at a staggering rate as well. Over the last couple of decades, you've seen not just the top 1%, but the top 1% of the population amass more and more and more wealth. So I think this is one of the great challenges of this moment in American history. And you are absolutely right, Henry, to point out that there is an enormous racial element to that as well, which is a legacy of slavery and of structural racism from the founding of this country forward. I do believe that restitution plays a role in the way that we should think about trying to address that. So I think we should have a serious conversation about the way that we can remedy historical and ongoing inequalities. And also, I mean, we talked about at the beginning in the invocation about the ongoing mistreatment and certainly shameful historical mistreatment of Indigenous folks. So that needs to be part of that conversation as well. In the short term, one thing we can all do is fight like hell for the Fair Share Amendment. And it is not a solution to the larger problem, but I do think that we need to start taking concrete steps to ask the wealthiest in our society to pay a little bit more so that we can invest in the basis for a broad-based economy that works for everyone. Some of that is making investments in things like public education. And I hope we have a chance to talk a little bit more about public education, because I think the structural racism that we've been talking about is deeply apparent. We're 68 years after Brown versus Board of Education. We still have segregated schools, and we still have stunning disparities in terms of the educational opportunities, depending on where you live and the color of your skin. So addressing that set of structural challenges needs to be part of the conversation as we're thinking about how to remedy some of these injustices.
Thank you, Quentin. Robin.
How would your office advance decriminalization of substance abuse and substance use and shift to a public health model? I know the current AG was very slow also about marijuana legalization.
So let me take a narrow answer to it and then do a broader one. So I think that one of the things we ought to do is expunge the records of people who were convicted of things that are no longer crimes. We know that there is a huge racial disparity in terms of who was affected by that. And we ought to go backwards and expunge those records and try to make some of that right. We also should, and this is more something that the Governor's Council and the governor can do, but we should be systematic in the way that we use pardon power to try to address some of the structurally racist sentencing legacy that we inherit as a Commonwealth. More broadly, I very much identify myself with the progressive prosecutor movement. I think that Rachel Rollins is a very good example of, or some of her policies are very good examples of what we should do, which is be innovative in using prosecutorial discretion to try to alleviate some of the racial disparities and the over-incarceration in our system. Also open up the data sets simultaneously. I ran the poverty lab at MIT. One of the things that it does is use evidence and evidence-based policy to make sure that what we're doing is working. And I think one of the cool things about what Rachel did was she opened up those data sets, asked scholars to help her understand in real time how our innovations were working or not working to allow us to do more of the things that work and course correct in real time. So I think that that's a really good innovation. There are some opportunities for the AG office to walk the walk on that. And the AG office does have some criminal powers. And so we ought to integrate that approach into our own practices. But I think the much bigger role that the AG can play in moving forward this progressive prosecutor movement is as a thought leader. I think that we need to be bold in using the platform, the bully pulpit of the office to push forward some of these reforms and to work impatiently with the legislature to try to push for more criminal justice reforms, such as decriminalizing poverty, eliminating cash bail, a number of the corrections reforms that we were talking about. So the AG, through its power of persuasion and its platform, can be a really powerful voice for some of those reforms, even beyond kind of what we do in our own office.
Thank you, Quentin. Henry.
Okay, so we have a question from someone in our live audience that actually reflects one of our prepared questions. So I'm going to use that one. Okay, red states are trying to make access to gender affirming care or traveling to a state like Massachusetts for gender affirming care a felony. Do you commit to making sure that the Attorney General's office doesn't cooperate with out-of-state investigations into healthcare and refuse to extradite to states that ban gender affirming care? And would you also, so let me follow this connected. Would you also commit to providing free legal services to trans people and families who have fled to our state for gender affirming care?
So the answer to both is an emphatic yes. And let me just start with a thank you. We've had an opportunity to engage with our Revolution's LGBTQ caucus and have endorsed the agenda, but also have learned a lot from your group. And I'm very grateful for the conversations we've had so far in this campaign. This is just heartbreaking. What the Texas Attorney General is doing with gender affirming care is just shocking. And, for those of you who don't know, wants to sort of use the power of the office to treat gender affirming care as the basis for child abuse investigations, literally sending investigators into families' houses. And I think in the premise of the questions with the idea that this is persecution, and I think it is. It is persecution by the Texas Attorney General and other states, I think, unfortunately, are headed in that direction. We are at a moment where our fundamental rights are under attack. And I do think that Massachusetts needs to lead the way in pushing back on that, but also provide refuge and safe haven for folks fleeing that kind of persecution. There is also a clear tie-in between what's happening in Texas and what the radical agenda of the US Supreme Court is. And clearly we've seen this coming for a long period of time. But that said, what we saw from Justice Alito last week was deeply, deeply chilling. And we saw attacks on reproductive rights front and center, and we're going to need to be protective of people fleeing that kind of persecution as well. But we also saw in that opinion the attempt to build the basis for attacking the entire basis for civil rights since the end of the Civil War, including LGBTQ rights, including equal marriage, including the right to contraception, including attacking the basis for striking down for Massachusetts AG, need to be at the forefront of fighting back.
Thank you, Quentin. Robin.
So this is an issue dear to my heart from my own experience as a homeowner. And I know my town is in the process of trying to limit the use of rodenticides. So will you support litigation or advocate for repeal of laws that prohibit municipalities from banning use of lawn care pesticides and rodenticides and other chemical agents that are harmful to wildlife?
That's so interesting. I'd love to learn more about this. I think in general, I think that's right. And one of the things that we've seen is, so for instance, have you looked at what happened with ospreys? So this is a really, really interesting story where for years there were chemicals that were killing the ospreys. And once those were banned and with some work to build up their habitats, the osprey population has totally rebounded in Massachusetts. And I certainly would love to learn more, but I would imagine that getting rid of some of those rodenticides and some of the other pesticides over a period of time could actually help to rebuild some of those animal species. So I'd love to look and I'd love to talk more about the specifics of it, but that seems directionally exactly right.
Thank you, Quentin.
Right.
Henry.
Okay, so shifting focus. Recent polling indicates that in Massachusetts and elsewhere, a significant proportion of young people, working class people, and members of communities of color are losing faith in the ability of the Democratic Party to deliver on its promises of an increased standard of living and better quality of lives for them. What does the party in this state need to do to address this alienation?
I think we need a bold progressive vision. I think that we need to stand by our values and fight for them at the local level. I think that we have the better values, particularly the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And we need to invest and make the case for single-payer health care. For investing in public schools, for fare free transit, for asking the folks at the top to pay more so that we can invest in an economy that works for everyone. I think that our policies fundamentally are better and they are winning policies, but I think too often we pre-negotiate, we compromise before we even make the argument. And I think that it's really important as progressives for us to be bold in our vision for transforming Massachusetts and the country and to make the case for what we actually believe in. Too often, I think what ends up happening is we abandon the things that we think would be best to try to find what we think that we could sell or find a compromise with, and then we don't even get that. And I think that people see through that and it feels phony. The other thing I will say, and I think this is at the heart of our revolution, is that we need to invest in the grassroots. The best campaigns are the campaigns that respect and empower and include people at the local level, that build from the kinds of things that people care about in their families and their communities, and that really trust and believe in grassroots campaigning, as opposed to some of these sort of talking points and poll tested and, the robocalls and the, tweets and, you need to use the tools of mass communication, but the heart of a campaign should be at the grassroots. And I think if we can remember that and build from that and have really diverse and inclusive grassroots campaigns, we can make the case to voters that our vision and our values and our plans are the best.
Thank you, Quentin. Robin.
How do you think the state can prepare to provide services to out-of-state women who come here for abortions or for trans and other LGBTQ people who arrive to escape prosecution in their home states? And what do you think you can do from the Attorney General's office?
It's funny. I was on the Common the other day with some of you, just looking around, both sort of inspired and also just so outraged that we're still here, that we're back, that it's worse, and that we need to build these contingencies and plans. And the other thing I think that I realize is that there's not someone out there who is going to provide an answer to these problems. Congress is not going to fix this. The US Supreme Court is not going to fix this. The solutions to these attacks on our values are going to come from the grassroots and from state leaders working together to address these kinds of challenges. And we are going to have to do three things. One, make sure that our laws are the best they possibly can be. Number two, have state leaders who are willing to fight for the most expansive implementation of those laws. And then the third is the one that's implicit in the question, which is we then also need to lead the way nationally. We need to prepare to help people who are being persecuted in other states, invest in that and create a structure for that. But we also need to lead the way back, right? The energy, the leadership for reclaiming our fundamental rights is going to have to come from places like Massachusetts, and maybe specifically from Massachusetts. You think about, we led the way on the abolitionist movement against slavery. We led the way on equal marriage. We led the way on the first stages of universal access to healthcare, although I think we have a long way to go. And Massachusetts has that tradition of leadership. We don't always live up to it, but we do need to live up to it in this instance.
Thank you, Quentin. And I just need to notify everyone, we're approaching our last question, which will be asked by Henry, and then we'll leave some time for Quentin to wrap up with a 2-minute closing statement. Henry.
Okay, so accountability and transparency are essential if we're going to deliver on our promises. And so despite having Democrats in the leadership of the both houses of the legislature, Massachusetts is, if anything, infamous for its lack of transparency and accountability. Arguably, there's evidence that we may be the least transparent state in the country. Is there a role for you or the Attorney General in attacking this problem, knowing that the legislature makes its own rules? Thank you.
So I think absolutely. And so let me start just with agreeing with the premise of your question. So we have an untransparent governor's office. You can't access the records or hold accountable the governor and the governor's team. You can't access the records and have access to information about the deliberative process of the legislature. We don't know how legislators vote on various measures, and that makes it impossible for us to hold them accountable. We have essentially an autocratic House of Representatives where the Speaker and the leadership team are able to largely determine the outcome of legislation. And that undemocratic approach has real consequences. So, for example, why don't we have election day registration right now in Massachusetts? It worked in 20 states and the District of Columbia. It works very well in New Hampshire. And we can't get it through the House of Representatives, in part, I think, because they're afraid that folks will vote against them. It bars from registering and voting young people, people who move around a lot, people of color. And that is threatening to an entrenched, empowered legislature. And so we do need to overcome these anti-democratic impulses in our on Beacon Hill in order to move forward with our democracy. The solve is harder. As you say, the legislature determines some of its own rules, but I think having someone outside of Beacon Hill culture, somebody who has not been endorsed by the Speaker of the House, for example, somebody who is not supported necessarily by the Beacon Hill establishment, as a statewide leader, puts you in a better position to shine a light on that, to be a watchdog, to call out the undemocratic culture and the untransparent culture. Having an attorney general who is willing to hold Beacon Hill accountable and willing to use the bully pulpit of the office to push for real democracy, I think is a really important step. The other thing I will say is we need to get corporate money out of our elections. There is too much capture. You see this, for instance, in the climate crisis and the relationship between the DPU and the energy companies, and you absolutely see it in the race for Attorney General's office, where there is a corporate super PAC supporting one of the candidates that in the last year has received $1.6 million from Jim Walton, from senior executives from Bain Capital, from Reed Hastings of Netflix. And if you have corporate money flowing into super PAC that is supporting one of the candidates, it is hard to then also expect the Attorney General to stand up against that culture. So we need to get corporate money out of our elections. Citizens United makes that very hard from a legal perspective. That's why we've called for a people's pledge and called for our competitors to swear off that money. So far, that's not working. But I do think that the question of transparency and democracy on the one hand and corporate influence on our elections on the other are intertwined.
It's time to wrap up. Many thanks, Quentin, for taking the time to address our members' questions. And may we have your 2-minute closing statement?
So first of all, thank you for this forum and for your leadership. I see our revolution as the very forefront of the push for a progressive future for Massachusetts. I want to make 3 arguments asking for your support for my campaign for AG. The first is experience. I think that it's important to have an attorney general who has the directly relevant experience of having been a senior leader in the attorney general's office. I also led a team of about 400 lawyers in the Biden administration. I believe that I can take over the attorney general's office on day one and lead a bold progressive agenda. The second is progressive values. I'm very proud to have earned the support of Progressive Mass and the Progressive Dems of Mass by 62 and 67%. I would be honored to earn your support because I think I am the real progressive in this race. And if you go through the issues and our values, whether that's single payer, whether that's safe injection sites, whether that's fighting against expansion of charter school, fare free transit, police accountability, rent control, and a whole series of issues. I believe I'm the most progressive candidate in the race and the one that is most aligned with our revolution's values. And then finally, I do think that the Attorney General needs to be independent. And we have never in the history of Massachusetts had a corporate super PAC support an attorney general candidate. And if you want the attorney general to stand up for universal access to healthcare, you can't also have for-profit healthcare companies funding the super PAC supporting a candidate. If you want the attorney general to stand up for public schools, you can't also have the charter school backers, Jim Walton and others funding a corporate super PAC supporting the Attorney General. If you want to stand up for housing, you can't have the developers funding those campaigns. If you want the AG to stand up for an economy that works for everyone, you can't have Bain Capital and the Waltons funding those campaigns. So I promise you that if I am the Attorney General, I will stand up for the values that we share. I will stand up for the people, because that's what the Attorney General should do. That's what the people's lawyer should do. That's the kind of Attorney General I want to be. And I would be honored to stand shoulder to shoulder with you, fighting for a more just and inclusive Massachusetts.
Thanks for joining us, Quentin. Thanks to ORMA members for your questions. We are sorry if we did not get